me restart it. Today, I would be covering two judgments, one from the Finland and another from the Nigeria. The Finland judgment is from the Supreme Court, that is the Supreme Administrative Court of Finland, and the case name is AOY, where reference number is KHO 2020-34, dated 2nd April 2020. And another case is from Nigeria. This is the first transfer pricing case of Nigeria from Tax Appeal Tribunal. And the case name is Prime Plastichem Nigeria Limited. And reference number is TAT LZCIT 015-2017, dated 19th February 2020. Both cases are very important. In the Finland case, the case is about continuous loss-making company. And as far as Nigeria is concerned, the case is about CUP versus TNMM. So let's go one by one. Let's start with the Finland case first. In case of the Finland, this AOY is a company which is registered in Finland and involved in the sales and marketing, or we can simply say it's a distribution entity or a distributor entity for the international group. The Finland entity used to import finished products from the international group contract manufacturing units and used to resell those products in its own territory and obviously maybe outside the territory also. The facts as mentioned in the judgment are AOY had operated as a marketing and sales company of an international group in Finland. With the exception of 2008, the company's operations had been unprofitable in 2003 to 2011, so many years, while at the same time the group operations had been profitable overall. AOY had purchased the product from AEs operating as contract manufacturers. The method used by the taxpayer for benchmarking was TNMM, considering contract manufacturing units as the tested party. So in order to benchmark the purchase transaction, AOY took foreign entities, contract manufacturing units as the tested party and benchmarked the margin or the markup charged by those entities using TNMM. So one of the biggest questions that comes when you are into loss, when the distribution entity into loss, and for so many years, we can see from 2003 to 2011, except 2008. So why not take AOY as a tested party? And this would going to be the obvious approach of tax authorities to take AOY as a tested party. And why not this entity can get extra remuneration? In an arm's length scenario, if assume you are a distributor, would you going to continue the business for such a long time without having profit? This was the case. So the approach adopted by the tax office, they put reliance on the OECD TP guidelines for 2010. And they were of the view that in an independent business transactions, the sales company would have agreed to continue related pricing, aid, or other equivalent credit as an adjustment for ongoing losses. So, which means, the local entity, that the trading entity, would have demanded something extra. They would have said, hey, look, I cannot continue the business. I need to shut down, or you give me some extra remuneration, because nobody will going to continue in losses for a long, unless there are reasons. Unless you are looking for, let's say, to build the market, you're on a market penetration strategy, or there are some other reasons. If there are no specific reason why a distributor will sell your product, will sell the product of a manufacturer at loss. So what the tax office did, they rejected the contract manufacturing units as the tested party and instead took Finland entity as the tested party. So also an analysis of the manufacturing companies had not made it possible to assess AOY situation with sufficient reliability in relation to the long-term losses of AOY's operation. So they said, we will take distributor entity as the tested party and not contract manufacturing units, because when we are analyzing contract manufacturing units, we are not able to analyze the position of AOYs. We all know that the TNMM is the one-sided method. So if we are benchmarking contract manufacturing unit, so this one-sided method is focused on the margin earned by the contract manufacturing unit and not focused on the margin earned by the distributor entity. So because of this, they rejected the approach of the taxpayer, that is taking foreign companies as the contract manufacturing unit, and the tax office took the local company, that the distributor entity, as the tested party, and thus considered AOIs as the tested party and accordingly proposed TP addition. Because now it's obvious that being this local entity, AOI is into losses. So by applying, by benchmarking the profitability of this Finland entity, certainly the result would be, TP additions. The case went to several levels and finally ended up in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court observed the loss making nature of the group company, very important judgment, I must say. The loss making nature of the group company did not in itself indicate that company had failed to collect a service fee or other consideration from another group company whose activities could be considered to benefit the loss making group company. So the court observed, just because the distributor entity is into loss or into losses for continuous period, it does not mean that this entity needs to collect something extra in form of service fee or some other consideration from other group companies. This was a matter on the basis of which it was possible to assess when submitting the tax whether the market conditions of the transfer price of the loss making group company should have been examined in more detail. So they observed this could be the trigger point. If the distributor entity is into loss for a continuous period, it could be the trigger which requires, which forces the tax authorities, or which because of which tax authorities may do deep dive into the case, that why this entity is into the loss. But just because you are into loss, you cannot start making an addition. Taking into account the activities performed by AOI on the one hand and the contract manufacturers belonging to the A group on the other hand, the risk borne by them and their assets, AOI should not have been chosen as the company to be tested party instead of the contract manufacturer. So what the court observed, that if you do the proper FAR or based on the functional asset and risk analysis, in this case, the contract manufacturers are more simpler entities, and because the contract manufacturers are more simpler entities, so one should take contract manufacturers as the tested party and not the distributor entity as the tested party. Further, the court observed that it had not been alleged in the case that AOI's transfer pricing had not been carried out in accordance with the transfer pricing documentation prepared by the group, or that the independent companies referred to in the group transfer pricing documentation were not comparable. So basically, the tax authorities, they failed to find lacuna in the benchmarking strategy adopted by the taxpayer. So it seems, and it comes out from the judgment, that nowhere tax authorities were able to find the problem in the benchmarking approach adopted by the taxpayer. So why the contract manufacturing unit should not be considered as the tested party? Just they gave the one-liner that it is a one-sided method. But why? If the contract manufacturing entities are simpler entities, if the data is available, why one should not take contract manufacturing units as the tested party, or not very came out strongly from the tax authorities. And therefore, and because AOI had presented business reasons for its loss, the Supreme Administrative Court ruled in the favor of the taxpayer. Importantly, because they were not able to, the tax authority was not able to find fault in the approach of the taxpayer. And in addition, because the AOI, the taxpayer, was able to give sufficient reasons for losses, the Supreme Court upheld in the favor of the taxpayer. So what becomes important is, in this case, the point that we need to learn is, if you are into loss, and if you wish to take foreign entity as a tested party, two things. One, you can only take foreign entity as a tested party if that entity is more simpler in comparison to you, in comparison to, in this case, distributor entity. Secondly, the comparable information is available for contract manufacturing units or for the foreign aids. Secondly, again, a very important thing. If you are into loss, what becomes important is to document the reason for loss. What are the reason for loss? You need to document. If you're not documenting the reason for loss, then you may face trouble. And I strongly believe, let's say if AOI in this case was not able to present the reason for loss, then this case could have gone into another direction. So what are the business reasons, which AOI presented to the court and also during the assessment? They say competitive and price sensitive industry. They are operating in competitive and price sensitive industry. Low resale price is because of market pressure. It's not because of the international transaction, but because of the market pressure. Inefficient organization and cost structure, and in particular to the way in which market development have been taken into account. So in comparison to the other competitors, the entity, this AOI, is inefficient and the cost structure is on the higher side. In addition, at the beginning of 2009, the company lost its B product representation, which was intended for the company's Nordic resale agent. This led to decrease in net sales of euro 22 lakhs, which was 28% of sales in Finland. The company's business began to financially productive in 2013. So, what my slides contained is only the brief. And if you go to judgment, you will find the more detailed business reasons given by the taxpayer. And probably if you go to the submission, you will find in submission they have given more detailed reasons. So the point to take home from this judgment is, if you are into loss, you must document reason for loss. Very important. And it should be dotted, that in this year, this was the reason, in this year, this was the reason, how it is impacting. They did the impact analysis, and they presented all the information to the tax authorities. Even though tax authorities took different stand, which was against the taxpayer, but when the case went to the Supreme Court, the taxpayer got a favorable judgment. So if you're into loss, nothing to worry. The only thing, you should document the reason for loss. And also, if you wish to take foreign entity as a tested party, you should not take foreign entity as a tested party just because you are into loss. I think if that foreign entity is less riskier, in comparison to you, then you can always take foreign entity as a tested party. And also if you have the comparable information available with you. Now let's move on to another judgment. It's from Nigeria, Prime Plastichem Limited, and this is the first trans-pricing judgment. Apparently, I feel, being this is the first year, probably the taxpayer did some mess up in doing the documentation, which led to the trans-pricing addition in this case. And this judgment is not in favor of the taxpayer. So the earlier judgment that we saw was in favor of the taxpayer. This judgment is not in favor of the taxpayer. And in both the cases, I think the difference lies in the documentation. And yes, what are the plus point, I will say, which taxpayer can use to litigate further. I'm going to discuss the same also. So the facts are, this Prime Plastic is again a distributor of Winmer Overseas Limited. A taxpayer, Prime Plastic, was a reseller of products imported from AE, particularly Winmer Overseas Limited. During the year under review, 2013 and 14, the taxpayer imported plastics and petrochemicals for resale. For 2013, the taxpayer applied CUP, that is comparable uncontrolled price method. But for 2014, the taxpayer applied transactional net margin method. For the purpose of CUP, internal comparable transactions were considered supplies made by the AE to uncontrolled parties. In 2014, CUP data was not available, and thus TNMM was considered for benchmarking. So this was the fact, which I can gather from the judgment. Now let's move on to understand the approach of tax office. So for both the years, that is 2013 and 2014, the tax office relied upon TNMM and rejected the CUP method, which was considered by the taxpayer for 2013. Interestingly, in this case, the tax office took gross profit by sales as the PLI instead of operating profit or EBIT, earning before interest and tax, over sales as the PLI. So generally, when it comes to TNMM, we take net profit or operating profit over sales as the profit level indicator. But somehow the tax office, in this case, took GP by sales as PLI, even though they opted for TNMM. And this is going to be one of the, I will say, most debatable point if the client or if the taxpayer chooses to go further. The comparable used by the taxpayer for TNMM were also rejected on the issue of cherry picking. The tax office argued that the comparables which taxpayer choose were not correct. The filtering was not correct, and basically taxpayer did cherry picking while selecting the comparables. So that's why we always say, when you are doing benchmarking using TNMM or any profit level method, taking foreign comparables, you must do a proper search and not just selecting few companies for your benefit. How this backfire this case is a classic case, which tells that if you are not doing documentation properly, it may backfire you. Sorry. Reason for using GP by sales as PLI over EBIT by sales, was given by the tax office. And as per them, EBIT requires taking into account other income and costs that were not related to the transaction. Very valid point. Difference in accounting system in different jurisdiction would distort the outcome and affect comparability. So generally, as far as this point is concerned, I feel it is debatable. Generally, we use TNMM to mitigate accounting differences. Herein, the case is reverse. The office is arguing that by taking GP by sales, difference in accounting system could be neglected. But if you read the guidelines or if you read various literature, it is the TNMM which takes care of different accounting system and not GP, not gross profit. So TNMM is more, I will say, good when it comes to taking care of different accounting policies. Comparability at gross level is more objective as there is little possibility of distorting arising from different income and cost profile of comparable entities. It's a very valid point. But if the cost profile, sometimes, and not sometimes, rather every time, I in my personal experience, I believe this cost profile represents the functional profile of comparables. And if there is a difference in the cost profile, it may indicate that there is a difference in the functional profile. And if there is a difference in functional profile, should we go for a gross margin analysis or should we go for a net margin analysis? Generally, if there is a difference in functional profile, we go for a net margin analysis and not for a gross margin analysis. And also, if there is a different income streams coming up, again, it could be one of the point which is in favor of using GP, gross profit, over net margin. But the cost profile is something on which taxpayer needs to analyze further. What are the comparables considered by the tax office, and finding whether this cost, the point which the argument which tax office wishes to take, that cost profile of comparable entities are different. Does it represent difference in the functional profile also? And if yes, then why going for GP? Why not net margin becomes very important. Let's see what is a judgment. Judgment is, the court observed that the taxpayer admitted CUP was mistakenly considered for benchmarking in 2013, and for this reason the taxpayer shifted to TNMM in 2014. So if taxpayer himself admitted that CUP that they took for 2013 is not correct, then certainly one cannot argue on CUP. So now the question comes, argument is only relating to transactional net margin method, and in TNMM The argument is whether we should take GP by sales or one should take operating profit by sales or net profit by sales. Secondly, whether the comparable selected by the office tax office vis-a-vis comparable selected by the SSC, uh, which one is better? Whether the comparable selected by the SSC are better or whether the comparables selected by the tax office is better. In this case, the comparable selected by the tax office was upheld over the comparables selected by the SSC. However, and to my surprise, the court also upheld gross profit margin as PLI over EBIT sales. So probably this is the first judgment I've seen uh, wherein the method was TNMM, but the profit level indicator chosen is gross profit by sales. So technically, with due respect, the judgment has gone probably, this point is litigative and taxpayer may find some relief with the higher authorities. So what becomes important in this case from taxpayers perspective is to demonstrate how TNMM is more beneficial vis-a-vis gross profit margin analysis, and generally we use GP in case of resale price method. So the debate that may happen in the higher court is resale price method vis-a-vis transactional net margin method. And I think we need to wait, till the case reaches to the higher court and what Nigerian high court or the top courts will going to say on this litigation point. So this was a small presentation for me, for all of you. If you have any query, you can put it in a chat box and I would be happy to reply. Okay, I cannot see any queries. Good, guys. So I would be uploading this presentation on my LinkedIn profile. You will find link to my LinkedIn profile in the description of this video. And it was good to see you. If you have any judgment which you want me to discuss on my YouTube channel, you can share that judgment with me on my email ID. I'm going to share my email ID in the description. Hope you like the discussion. We're going to continue this kind of discussion on every Sunday, wherein I would be taking a couple of the case laws, maybe one, two, or three. I don't know, depending upon the length of the case, and we're going to discuss every Sunday. Hope it will going to be useful for all of you. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining.